Hello everyone. Today I'll be showing you how to generate a Python SDK from an Arazzo workflow using Liblab. We'll be using the Petstore OpenAPI spec as our example to demonstrate the process. As you can see, I already have the openapi.json file locally. This is what we'll be using to create the workflow. So the first thing I'm going to do is create the workflow file. I'm going to say workflow.json. And the Arazzo spec is very similar to OpenAPI. We have the Arazzo keyword where we define which specification of Arazzo we're using, in this case, version 1. We also have an info object. So I'm just going to fill this out with some basic information, give it a title, a license, and a version. There we go. So next, we need to define where the different components and information will be coming from. So we'll use the source descriptions key. It takes an array of different sources, and the sources are defined by name. So I call this Petstore. You need to tell it what type, and in this case, this is an open API spec. And I'm going to use the URL to define where it is for simplicity. Now that we have the source descriptions, we need to actually create the workflows. So I'm going to create workflows, and I'm going to add a new workflow. So all workflows will have a workflow ID, and in this case, we're going to say fetch and clone favorite pet. I'll give it a summary, really doesn't matter. I'll give it a description. Now we can define our actual steps. So just like workflows, steps also have a step ID. Say step ID. In this case, we are going to retrieve favorite pet, give it a description as well. So now we need to reference an operation ID. This operation ID should be found in the spec, the OpenAPI spec that you reference. So in this case, we want to find show pet by ID. So here it is. We're going to be calling that operation ID. Next, we need to define the parameters. In this case, there's only one parameter. It's pet ID. Let's say name pet ID. I'm going to say that this parameter is in the path, and we'll give it a sample value. I'll just say 1, 2, 3. Now that we've defined the operation ID and the parameters, we need to specify the success criteria, and this is a set of conditions in which it knows that the workflow or the workflow step has succeeded. So we'll say condition, and we're going to use the status code. So I'm just going to say $status code equals 200. So 200 is an OK response. And finally, we'll define what this step outputs. In this case, we want to do 3 things. The pet name, and we'll say $response.body.name. We'll get the pet's tag, will be response.body.tag. And finally, the pet ID looks like that. Okay, so we've created our first step. Next, let's add another step. Say step ID, and we're going to create the pet clone. Create pet clone. I'll give it a description, and now we give it our operation ID. Look back here, create pet. So the operation ID is create pet. Stay right there. We'll also set the request body, since this is a post request body. And in our request body, we have a payload. And in our payload, we will use the name. And to dig out that name, we will say steps.retrieve_favorite_pet.outputs.petName. And we'll also use the tag that's part of the body, and we will say clone. Okay, now that we have our request body defined, we're going to set success criteria, and just like last time, we'll say if 201 successfully created, we will say it succeeded. And finally, we want to define our outputs, and our output will be called clone pet response, and that will be the response body. Okay, so we've defined all our steps. Let's close this. Now we need to define what the workflow should output. And in this case, I want the pet name, and we can get the value by saying steps.retrieve_favorite_pet.output.petName. And we want the clone pet response. To do that, we'll do steps.createPetClone.clonePetResponse. Okay, so now we have created our workflow file. All of this will be in the blog post linked below if you want to follow along and use it. Now that we have our workflow, we can actually generate a Python SDK with Liblab. So assuming you have the Liblab CLI installed, you can run Liblab init, and this will create your config file. It'll be called liblab.config.json, and this will have just a bunch of boilerplate information we can customize. We'll call this Petstore workflow. We can define things like the API name, Petstore. We can specify our spec file path, but in this case, we are just going to use the workflow file. So I'm just going to delete all of this. You can leave all the example customizations and additional information as is. And we can say workflows. Inside path, we're going to specify the path of our workflow JSON. So I'm just going to say workflow.json and output name. We'll call this workflows tutorial. Okay, that should be everything we need. Let's just specify the languages. In this case, we'll do Python. This is all you need for your config file, and you can now run Liblab build. Liblab build will take a few seconds to run. We need to specify the spec file path. So we will use the Swagger file. Here we go. So this is the same one that is in that workflow file. Now let's rerun it. Trying that again, we'll run Liblab build. It'll say that there's some issues with the spec. That's totally fine. We'll say, yes, we want it. It will start building the Python SDK, and it'll take maybe a few seconds. All right, and there you go, it built. So you should find your SDK in the output folder, and let's take a look at it real fast. So this is all the information that comes across. Let's take a look at the example. So here's how you instantiate your SDK, but we can utilize the workflow like so. Say SDK.workflows tutorial, that's what we created, and then use the specific workflow we want. We created fetch and clone favorite pet. And on the inside, this will run all of the different endpoints needed and handle all of the behavior and spit out the proper model. Let's look at the output. And like we said, at the end, we wanted pet name and clone pet response. For more in-depth information on this process and working with this SDK, look at the article linked in the description or attached here in the video. You can try this feature today by using Liblab, and if you have any questions, feel free to email us or join our Discord to ask questions. We're always here to help. Thank you and good night.